Hello, I'm Darren Harper, a teacher, writer and philosopher, and I want to welcome you to the first of a series of interviews I'm going to be doing on philosophy. This interview is going to be with Michael Travers, a former teacher of philosophy and certainly an important influence on my own philosophical development. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about Michael before I ask him some questions about philosophy. Michael Travers was born in Derry, Northern Ireland, in 1948. He's had around 40 different jobs throughout his working life, ranging from working in a factory in Carlisle to selling furniture in France. After gaining his degree, he qualified as a teacher at the University of Dublin, and then went on to teach Latin and French at Belvedere College. Not wanting to spend his whole life in education, he left his job and moved abroad, working both in France and in Spain. After that, he moved to London and became a careers advisor. But one weekend he came to Carlisle to visit his parents, who'd recently moved over from Derry, and, after going to the Lake District and contemplating life on a boat on Derwent Water, he decided that the Monday morning underground was not for him, and so left London for Carlisle, where he has lived ever since. For many years, Michael taught French and German in local secondary schools, and it was these jobs that helped to give him stability during a very difficult period of his life. In 1984, Michael, his wife Patricia, and their one-year-old twins Daniel and Jessica were happily settled in Carlisle. One day, in May of that year, Patricia had a pain in her stomach. She went for some tests and was diagnosed with cancer of the pancreas. She died 6 weeks later. The time which followed his wife's death was a difficult one for Michael, but he carried on, brought up his children, and is now a doting grandfather. After retiring from secondary school teaching in 2004, Michael began teaching an evening class in philosophy, as well as classes in literature and Italian opera. His courses attracted people from all walks of life, solicitors to factory workers, and they discussed such questions as, why are we here? Is there a God? And what is happiness? The courses were well attended, and a spin-off group was formed which met monthly to discuss other philosophical issues. Due to ill health, Michael is no longer able to teach these classes, but spends time reading, writing and thinking. He's currently working on a collection of essays which he hopes to publish later this year. So Michael, thank you for joining us. My first question is, how did you become interested in philosophy?
Well, actually, I can remember my first philosophical question when I was about 12 years old. You see, there's no such thing as a Catholic baby or a Hindu baby or a Marxist baby or a Muslim baby. You know, babies come out with a blank slate, tabula rasa, and all these other things are added to them. So it's really a matter of chance where you come out, and I happened to come out into a Catholic enclave in Derry. So I became a Catholic baby and went to Mass quite frequently. I loved the Latin Mass, you know, the beautiful Latin language. In fact, I was very disappointed years later when the Roman Catholic Church decided to change it so that all countries would have the Mass in their own language. I found that very disappointing because I believed, you know, when you were at the Latin Mass in Derry, you knew that there were people kneeling down in Bucharest or Tbilisi or Tirana, all saying exactly the same words. And to me, it was a universal sort of thing, the Latin language, you know. So I can see the reason why people wanted it in their own language, but at the same time, it was disappointing. So I loved the Latin language. And then the altar boys with the incense and the beautiful hymns, and just the whole thing, really. This is where my first philosophical question came up, really. Coincidentally, it was the first question that, Bertrand Russell poses in the very first page of the History of Western Philosophy, although I didn't know that at that time, of course. But so there was all this order, you know, the incense, the hymns, the language, the dulcet tones of the priest giving the sermon. And I sat down on the steps afterwards and just reflected, because I lived in the bogside of Derry, where there was like 40% unemployment. And basically it was like a Peter Bruegel painting come to life. You know, it was complete chaos. Barking dogs, screaming kids, banging doors. And the thought came to me, you know, of the contrast between the perfect order of the Mass and the chaos of my home environment. And that was probably my first philosophical question, you know, which is man? And a few weeks later, it was brought home to me in a different fashion, actually. I was sitting in my bedroom one night at the dressing table, full-length mirror, doing my homework. I was the only one on the street who passed the 11 plus, so I went to the grammar school, St. Colum's. So our homework was to learn a sonnet by John Keats, "When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain." So I'm looking in the mirror and repeating this sonnet. Now, my parents were away that evening, and my father's friend and his girlfriend were babysitting my younger brother. And just as halfway through reciting this sonnet, the door opened and the girlfriend came rushing in screaming, jumped over the bed, chased by the boyfriend with an empty Guinness bottle. She managed to get down the stairs and out the front door. And I sort of closed the book and looked in the mirror. And I thought, you know, there is a contrast again here, you know. So the question that Russell posed was, what is man? Is he the noble creature sort of dreamed up by Hamlet? Or is he this sort of piece of impure carbon and water, you know, crawling about on an impotent planet? So I was thinking, what is man? Is he someone who reads Keats' poetry in the evening? Or is he someone who chases his girlfriend with an empty Guinness bottle? Yeah. So, I mean, I was only 12 years old, but I remember distinctly that was my first real philosophical problem, you know. And for 17 years, I had intense Catholic conditioning, so all the answers were religious. I moved really, I mean, my position now would be what Russell calls complete philosophical insecurity. You know what I mean? But in those days, it was 100% certainty. I had a 100% certainty. God was in his heaven. The devil was in his hell. My guardian angel would pluck me out of the river if I drowned, if I was going to drown. So, you know, I went from complete certainty to complete insecurity. So that's how it began, really. I remember distinctly those reflections, and it all began. And my formal encounter with philosophy started when I went to University College Dublin at the age of 18 and did philosophy and Latin at university. But for the first 17 years, it was intensely religious.
So you were brought up in a very religious community. How did this affect your philosophical thinking?
When I left Derry for the first time and went to university in Dublin, I went to UCD. And our first philosophy lecturer was a priest who seemed to know only St. Thomas Aquinas. So it was a gentle transition. I didn't quite escape Catholicism so quickly, you know. But there were cracks began to appear in the edifice. I remember walking up Grafton Street in Dublin, and I lived at the top of Mrs. Patterson's sort of house in South Circular Road in Dublin. And a little bedsit right at the top. And I wanted a thick book to read during the winter nights under the blankets. And I just by chance picked out The Idiot by Dostoevsky. And that was really the start of cracks beginning to appear in this sort of certain edifice, because there were characters in The Idiot that I wondered why I was drawn to them when they were fallen characters, you know, like Grushenka, the prostitute, and things like this. You know, how can you like someone who's evil? And, you know, and this was confusing for me, really. Because really I lived in a world of cowboys and Indians for 17 years, you know, where the goodies always won and the baddies always died. You know, so really, the minute I read a book like that, and then about 100 books after it in the next sort of 40 years, inch by inch, you know, there were cracks appearing until the whole edifice crumbled completely.
So, Michael, Why should we do philosophy, any of us? How can it benefit us?
Bertrand Russell said that look at someone who has no philosophy, not a single tinge, as he calls it, of philosophy. What sort of life do they live? They live in a cocoon of the ego, of their self. They're only interested in their own job, their own life, their own family. They're very suspicious of outsiders. They have no curiosity, no wonder. With philosophy, every simple thing, whether it's the nail on your forefinger or whether it's the Empire State Building, becomes of interest. Where did it come from? Why was it built? What use has it? What value has it? Could there be a world without such a thing? But this person without philosophy doesn't have any curiosity. As long as they can get their drink, play their game of darts on a Monday night, get to bed at the right time, be paid at the end of the week for working on the factory line, then they're quite happy. They don't want to know anything else. They don't want to read literature. They don't want to work out what opera is. They don't want to understand why we still listen to Mozart, 400 years after he was born. And so they have no interest in that because that doesn't do anything. They just want their own little cocoon, their level of comfort. And that's a life that doesn't have any philosophy. So if you can imagine what the opposite is, the sense of wonder at the simplest thing, the sense of awe, that's the encapsulation. That's what Plato said philosophy was. A philosopher really should be vulnerable every second to the beauties of the world and the ugliness of the world. Just a total sort of awareness.
So I mentioned in the introduction the tragic circumstances under which your wife passed away. Did philosophy help you during this difficult time?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. It certainly was a difficult time. There was a sunny day in June when we'd finished making plans for opening a cafe where I would be the French waiter because I could speak French. And Patricia was a cordon bleu cook. She'd cooked at the theatre by the lake and so on. So it seemed a perfect combination for an interesting cafe. And we'd just had twins, which was a bit of a luxury really because she'd had a miscarriage and we'd both decided that was it. There was something wrong. We'd never have any children. So it was even more beautiful, to actually have these twins, which were about a year old. And she said she had a small pain in her stomach. I said, well, we might as well get it checked up, So she went to the doctors. And then she said, well, I've got an appointment at the hospital. Went up to the hospital. She went to see the consultant. I looked after the children outside. 2 prams. Well, one pram. 2 compartments. And basically I sat outside and then he opened the door and called me in. And she sat outside with the children. I said, well, what's the crack? He said, well, she has cancer of the pancreas. He said, it hasn't been diagnosed. He said, we can operate next week. He said, but there would be less than a 50-50 chance of survival. And so I walked out again. So there's this sunny day. The children, the wife, all these plans, and suddenly this news, and we walk out into the sunlight, and I don't know where my head was, but as time went on, she in fact only lasted 6 weeks. Philosophy, particularly Stoicism, which I was heavily into at that time, I found it great. People don't understand Stoicism. The reason they don't understand it is because it's got this sort of British stiff upper lip idea, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Stoicism, And then there's this idea that the Stoics are cold because they say that you must be able to put up with any external catastrophe, therefore they have no emotions. But that isn't what it's about. What it's about is being able to feel emotions intensely, so you cry, but at the same time to keep it in a cosmic perspective, you know what I mean? We are just a tiny dot in a vast universe, probably a multiverse, and you don't consciously think of this. You don't hold someone's hand and cry and think, oh, by the way, we're part of a multiverse. You know, you don't rationalize it in that sense. But behind all the emotions, you know, there is this idea that you're part of something very much bigger, you know what I mean? Everyone has to die. Everyone gets born. Everyone dies. Although it's only afterwards, in tranquility, as Wordsworth might say, that you actually sit down, you know, wipe your tears and actually rationalize it in this sense. But so the philosophy isn't at the top of your consciousness, but it's sort of helping you to get through it, really.
Yeah.
You know, because you just have a different mindset, which doesn't stop the emotions in any way whatsoever. So the emotions come first, and then the philosophy. But you know, I would have thought, you know, what do you do without philosophy? What do people do without philosophy? They simply go through the emotional thing, and then perhaps they become even bitter or over sentimental, or you know, it changes their life in bad ways, really. You know, they find themselves. But I had 2 children, and that was very interesting, because these emotions were so intense at the time that I thought they're going to drive me completely nuts. You know, I'll go mad, especially when I heard the children crying. And a social worker who had a great influence on me, she came round and she took me up to the local pub and bought me half a beer. And she said, well, what about it, Michael? I said, well, I'm you know, 2 screaming infants. And I said, all these emotions, I think I'm going to go mad. She said, well, can I tell you something? Do you know what will happen if you crack up? I said, no. She said, people will arrive at the door in a car, right? 4 of them. They will come in, they will take the children away, and you may not even see them again. And then she walked out. And I thought, that's it, I'm not going to crack up. So she was a major influence. But yeah, so yeah, the philosophy, rather, you don't sit down, you know, and read a page of Bertrand Russell and think, oh, now I can cope with my dying wife, you know. It doesn't work like that. But it under sort of, you know, underlies your entire behaviour.
Mm. Having read quite widely, you'll absorb quite a lot, and then I suppose many of this will just re-immerse intuitively when trying to deal with
exactly, because then unconsciously, exactly, yeah. It becomes part of you, really.
So far in the interview, you've referred to a couple of different philosophers who've obviously interested you, including Plato, Bertrand Russell, and the Stoics. Can you tell me which philosophers have had the greatest impact on you?
I discovered a couple of women philosophers, Elizabeth Anscombe and Martha Nussbaum, who give me great insights into the human condition. But basically, looking back over 50 years, I suppose you're really talking about the dead white males, you know, of the philosophical canon, which, you know, I got things from each of them, really. Like Kant, for example. I don't think anyone who does a serious study of Kant can emerge unscathed. You know, Kant is a life-changing philosopher. I particularly liked his idea on human rights, which isn't a popular idea, and definitely not one that applies to modern governments. If you brought someone in, some terrorist suspect now, the idea that he should be tortured because he could give information that would save thousands of lives. In other words, the prevailing utilitarian view. Kant wouldn't agree with that, because Kant believed that you should respect every human being simply because they are a human being, and that the world would be a better place if you did. So Kant wouldn't torture him. He would respect his humanity. That had a great effect on me, the absolute respect for every human being. I mean, look now, people will throw bombs into restaurants, kill 100 people that they've never met, never know, change all these lives, you know, of wives, losing wives, somebody lost a daughter, somebody lost that, you know, and why? Presumably for some ideology that wants to make a better world. But Kant would think that's rubbish. Each of those 100 people, you know, deserved respect as a human being. So that had a great influence on me. Plato led me to think about this world, and is this world the only reality? through his theory of forms. Descartes gave me the courage to, Descartes' meditations give me the courage to throw off the shackles of my past conditioning and rebuild. Wonderful idea of rebuilding your whole value system from scratch. I loved that idea, when I read the meditations, that you can wake up in the morning and no matter what's gone on before, what you've believed or haven't believed and what conflicts you've had, you can start completely from scratch. You can clean the house out and go back. And of course, Descartes tried that and came up with the famous cogito ergo sum as the foundation stone. So I was able to look for my own foundation stone. And then there was David Hume, of course, whose skepticism, he taught me that skepticism was a wonderful weapon for combating dogma and propaganda. So those would have been the major sort of influences, really.
So far in the interview, you've mentioned a couple of different literary influences as well, Wordsworth and Keats. I'm also aware that you enjoy reading lots of novels, particularly philosophical novels that are rich with philosophical ideas. Can you tell me which of these has had the greatest impact on your thinking?
I'd like to make clear, first of all, that I've also read lots of novels for pleasure. I used to love John Buchan, for example, and the exploits of Richard Hannay, trying to catch spies all over Europe. So not all the novels I read are for philosophical reasons, but I could probably name about 20, but if I could pick out 2 or 3 that made me think. One certainly would be Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, Das Glasperlenspiel, because that led me to think about the necessities of reason and the limits of reason. I thought it was a wonderful depiction of that idea. And then there was Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks, which was a wonderful novel, which led me to think about the influences on your daily life of family relationships and the lust for power and so on. And perhaps one more might be The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which led me to think about, religious belief and where it fits in, and what actually happens when God is dead. But it's a great novel on all sorts of levels because it's also a romance and it's also a thriller, and it's got to be. Albert Einstein said that he learned more from the Brothers Karamazov than he did from all the scientific journals that he read. So I'm not alone in thinking that there's a lot in the Brothers Karamazov. So those would be. Obviously Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, which was a marvelous fictional depiction of the concept that why you shouldn't be a Buddhist even if you like the Buddha, and why you shouldn't be a Christian even if you like Jesus and so on. There was a great depiction of that, because in Siddhartha, Siddhartha meets the Buddha and realizes he is the wisest and most beautiful man he's ever seen. But he also realizes that what the Buddha experienced was right for the Buddha, but that he couldn't pass it on. You have to find your own path.
Yeah, he doesn't take the ready-made ideal of the Buddha, even though he recognizes that as a super path and that he's found wisdom and enlightenment, but instead, quite bravely, chooses to find himself, take another direction and still find himself.
That's why all these televangelists are wrong, when they stand up and say to their followers, be like Jesus, that's not, Jesus was an enlightened man, no doubt, obviously, but you've got to find your own path. You've got to take what he says and then go and, he opens the door, but you've got to walk through it. So it's not be like Jesus, it's be yourself, he should be saying, but if that doesn't get money for the televangelists, so they don't say that.
So finally, what are the key philosophical questions for today?
We live in a funny age, don't we, really, where the zeitgeist is completely anti-rational. When the most powerful person in the world, can express extremely complicated ideas through a tweet, there's something radically wrong. You can't do philosophy through a tweet. You know what I mean? It takes hours and hours of research and quiet reflection. Universities are closing philosophy departments because they're under pressure from students and their families to do courses which lead to a nice salaried position. And that's the sort of world we live in, really. It's a valueless world. Michael Sandel said that if you listen to political debates, what is absent from them are questions of the good life. Now, in ancient Athens, politicians did talk about the good life. Ethics and politics went together. It was obvious when a politician like Pericles or someone like that stood up in ancient Athens that he would have to talk also about the good life. What is the philosophic good life? How do you love your neighbour? You know, this doesn't come up. You don't hear Theresa May standing up and saying, let's talk about how you love your neighbour. You know, she'll talk about how can we get another 2% onto GDP. So where the good life is absent from discussion, market forces take over, and the mighty dollar becomes the measure of all things. You know, is it right to preserve Mozart's operas? Well, how much will it cost? No, we'll do something else. You know, we'll turn it into a McDonald's. Yeah, and that's the prevailing culture we live in, really.
More concerned with a materialist life than a good life.
But in terms of the philosophical questions, they're not time dependent, Darren. You know, the questions that young intellectuals asked each other in Athens would be the same that philosophy students ask each other now in New York. You know, who are we? What is our place in the universe? How do we live the good life? So, you know, they don't age, philosophical questions. The questions that Socrates asked and no one could answer, people still ask, and no one can answer.
And we should still ask them, really. I was thinking about the universities. You'd mentioned about universities earlier, and quite recently many students have been protesting essentially against kind of freedom of speech because they're so keen to protect and preserve certain ideas and keep them isolated from discussion or debate. What's your view on this?
What do you mean by protesting against freedom of speech? I thought that was a great value of
Well, I think
students.
that it is a great value, but I think the world's become very, very kind of politically correct nowadays, and there are certain things that people kind of are scared to say or express because you kind of get shot down for having such a strong opinion against something. You'll immediately be accused of being, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
So I think rather than fighting for kind of freedom of expression, students have been more keen to prevent other people expressing their views at the risk of offending them or others.
Yeah.
Do you know, there seems to be a fine balance, a difficult argument at the moment between ensuring you don't offend somebody, but still ensuring that people have freedom of free speech and freedom of expression.
Yeah, but because people don't think deeply now, you know, their attention span lasts roughly the time it takes for an advert from start to finish. And, you know, because people don't think deeply, then, you know, you have this sort of lack of understanding of what's really going on. It's amazing how things don't change. You know, I remember asking a class, giving them a quotation, you know, of young people in the street saying we don't accept what you're saying and so on, and spitting at old people instead of respecting them, and asking them, you know, to guess which era it came from, and everyone had various guesses, Dickensian London and, you know, and so on. And they were amazed when they heard that it was, you know, 515 BC in Athens. You know, so it's amazing how things don't change.
Yes.
You know, human nature seems to have been the same from Nero to Donald Trump. You have the same mistakes. I mean, Socrates would be absolutely amazed now, you know, after 2,500 years, that people are not sitting down and, you know, discussing things tranquilly and philosophically, that they're coming out with sound bites and insults and you know, obvious propaganda. You know, it would just be amazed. You know, you've had 2,500 years, for Christ's sake. See, I think mankind, you know, has made some wrong turnings. You know, they've had various chances. They had a chance in Socratic Athens, which they didn't take. They had a chance in the 18th century Enlightenment to get rid of all the religious nonsense, which they didn't take. You know, And then they had, they had various chances. But along came the Industrial Revolution, and everything became money. Everything became the mighty dollar, really. So, we've missed so many chances, and this is why Noam Chomsky said that all species, tend to disappear after 100,000 years, and we are now at 999,999. And this is the reason we are on self-destruct mode. We've had so many chances. How can a man like Donald Trump stand up now, 2,005 years after Socrates? Just how? It's ridiculous. There's not a tinge of philosophy in anything he says. And yet he is supposed to be the leader of the free world. So the idea that we're going to be wiped out, it might be fearful for some people, but it seems obvious to most, unfortunately, to most modern philosophers. If the sun burning up doesn't get us, and climate change doesn't get us.
Donald Trump will.
Donald Trump will, yeah.
Yeah, he would certainly benefit from reading a little Plato.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would benefit. It would benefit from going home and sitting down quietly and listening to Mozart and reflecting. But I doubt if that'll happen. They showed an interview from 25 years ago with him last night when he was talking. All he talks about is himself and how many millions he made and so on. How he was going to get even with all those who hadn't given him a loan, and he named them all. I'll get him. I'll get him. I'll bring him down. I've got ways, I've given this guy a threat and he's left, and I'll get the rest. And this was him 25 years ago, and he hasn't really changed. But I think Donald Trump's. I'm really pleased Donald Trump's there in some ways, because the only way people can understand why philosophy is necessary is a wonderful embodiment of what happens when you don't have philosophy. You know what I mean? And people can see every day, oh yeah, this is why we need philosophy.
He'd be good for getting to grips with logical fallacies.
Well, I would show him to a class. Yeah, I would definitely show his speeches to a class. Yeah, and say, right, this is the leader of the free world, and universal justice and global. Just pick out his statements and his arguments. They'd be wonderful because they're so vacuous. Yeah. Make America great again. What does that mean?
Nothing really. It's just hot air.
Yeah. What's sad though is the millions of people that vote for him and support him. And I always listen very, very intently, when they say we've taken our cameras to some sort of Luxville in Arkansas or something, to the Donald Trump supporters in this cafe, and we're going to ask them, why they voted for Donald Trump. And I always listen to that very intently, because now we'll find out, because there's something wrong here. And yet all their answers are totally disappointing. They're all just as vacuous as him. They'll say things like, oh, he's going to bring change. Well, what does that mean? Nero brought change to Rome, Oh, what does that mean? He's going, another guy said, he's a breath of fresh air. What's that mean? If they said, this is a man who has studied Immanuel Kant and who is now going to change all the alienation, of the working class, and you'd be listening, you'd be thinking, great, that's why you voted for him. But no one does vote for him for any reason other than
hollow metaphors.
Other than they fall for it. It's the same reason why when you turn on the televangelists, they've got thousands, it seems like hundreds of thousands in one room. And from the pulpit they're giving out, they're slapping this holy book and saying this is the way to live. But they leave out key passages, of course, in the holy book. For example, there's a story in the Bible, one of the books of the Old Testament, about a gang rape, where an old man invites a stranger into the house because strangers, according to the code of the day, had to be given respect. And the mob comes looking for the stranger, and he said, well, you can't have him, but you can have my daughter. So they gang rape the daughter, but they never shout this out from the microphones, They always pick their passages.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are other examples of homophobia and sexism and lots of things, aren't there, really?
Well, according to Steven Pinker, there's over 1 million examples in the Old Testament of wanton random violence by Yahweh, God. You know, he has a bad hair day and he suddenly sends a flood to people who've sacrificed a bull instead of a cow. You know, it's ridiculous. And people think this is the word of God. It's so obvious, so obviously the word of man.
Yes, absolutely. Right. Well, thank you very much for coming in today for this interview. It's been great chatting with you. Hopefully see you again soon.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this interview and would like to learn more about philosophy, then check out my website, darrenharper.net, where there's information about courses and also resources available on philosophy. Thank you. Bye-bye.